Christian apologists go as far back as the first century of the church. We see in the letter of 1 Peter telling the Christians to be prepared to make a defense for why they have their faith and what they believe in. We see in the 2nd century someone like a Justin Martyr who writes his apologies, letters of defense to the emperor saying why he should stop persecuting the Christians because of their faith. And we see this go all the way up even till today, where we have peoples whose sole occupation or hobby or thing they just like to do is defending the Christian faith, explaining what it is, what it's not, protecting it from false doctrine and also from false testimony. And one of the most famous Christian apologists of all time is probably a guy named C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is known for his literature. He has books such as The Chronicles of Narnia, The Great Divorce, and his Space Trilogy, but he's also known for more theological heady books like Mere Christianity and other books such as that. One book that he talks about and that he writes on deals with suffering and pain, and he titles it The Problem of Pain. In this book, he asks the question that everyone asks. How can there be pain in the world but a good God? And ultimately, as he gives his answer to this, he sums up pain by saying pain alerts us to there's rebellion in the world, that the world is not as it should be. Maybe the person experiencing pain is not as they should be. And so pain is an instrument of God to alert the world to where it's not as it should be and that it's in rebellion against God. About 20 years later, Lewis writes another book called A Grief Observed, where he struggles with another question related to this. What do we do with pain in the presence of God? In this book, he has a little bit of a different tone than he did in the first one. He actually seems to have a hard time harmonizing pain and sorrow and suffering with God's presence. It seems like they actually cannot both coexist, that if there's sorrow and pain and suffering, it actually seems like it's not an instrument of God. It seems like God is just gone. God is just distant. So you have the problem of pain, and then you have grief observed. 20 years in between, what happened? And as most people know, C.S. Lewis experienced the loss of his dear wife to cancer. That this is the moment that actually leads up to him writing A Grief Observed. In that season of his life of grieving the loss of his wife, Lewis had to deal with people trying to offer comfort, offer hope to him as he was dealing with the suffering. We have all heard these same type of statements, and truly, as I say this, I know for sure I myself have said this or have thought this as people were going through really hard moments. Lewis heard things like, God is with you. Heard things like, they're in a better place now. He heard things like, they're dead now, they're gone now, but they will come back in the resurrection when Jesus comes back. And all of these things may very well be true. But in the midst of sorrow, these words come across as cheap. These words of hope in the midst of sorrow don't seem to really offer anything of substance. They seem to just be a gong that clangs and gives us no lasting experience of relief. As we open up the book of Lamentations, the chapter 1, we are met with this same experience of suffering and sorrow, as sorrow is shouted from the poet Jeremiah. That instead of going over it, instead of going under it, they go through it, and grief has its day. What Lamentations invites us into is to let sorrow shout. We are invited to meditate not only on the beautiful, but also on the ugliness, not just the joy, but also on despair, not just celebration, but also on desolation. There is no hope at all offered in this chapter. And really, honestly, in the entire book of Lamentations, besides maybe a small bit in Lamentations chapter 3. And I think even as I give this lesson and as you are listening to this, I am so tempted to say, well, here's a nice thing that we can take from this chapter, a thing of hope. And we'll get to maybe something like that. But I want us to just recognize that Lamentations chapter 1 is all about the sorrow being shouted. It's all about letting sorrow have its day before letting hope have its day. And so here's the takeaway for us in this moment as we deal with Lamentations 1 and as we deal with even our own lives and people we come in contact with as we ourselves are dealing with suffering. Lamentations chapter 1 gives us this message. Lament requires feeling the pain of the suffering before offering words of hope. Let me say it again. Lamentations chapter 1, the takeaway. Lament requires feeling the pain of the suffering before offering words of hope. Instead of hope offered, sorrow is offered. Sorrow is shouted. And as it shouts, there are three things that it invites us into. There are three actions that it requires us to do as we hear the shout. The first action that we are asked to do is to hear the shout, to hear the sorrow. Let's go ahead and open up Lamentations chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, just wanting to look at the first line of this poem. It begins by saying this: "How lonely sits the city that once was full of people." Lamentations begins by opening up by looking at a city, but in particular by looking at a woman. We don't know much about this woman, but we find out in a few verses later that this woman, this city personified as a woman, is Jerusalem. But as we continue to read more of Lamentations chapter 1, we find out that it's not just a woman, it's not just Jerusalem sitting there, but things begin to become much and much worse for this woman. This is actually a pretty common practice in the ancient world of personifying cities as women. There's nothing to it in the sense of significance. It is this idea that God is supposed to be the king, and so that the city is supposed to be the queen, the bride. And we do this today with many different things. We'll talk about sister colleges or sister churches, or we talk about our yachts in a certain way if you own a yacht, right? We just normally give these personifications to these entities. So there's nothing more to it besides saying that Jerusalem is being personified as a woman, but we end up finding out certain things about this city, about this widowed lady city, that ends up making us feel the sorrow and hearing more about it. So let's go ahead and continue to keep discovering this. Starting in verse 1, and I'm just going to pick around and look at a few verses that we can add to understanding this image of who this city is, who this woman is. So verse 1 continues, "How like a widow she has become. She that was great among the nations, she that was a princess among the provinces, has become a vassal." Something that is used by another nation is this idea of what a vassal is. So this is not just a woman, but she is a widow, someone that is normally on the margins of society, someone that normally doesn't have anyone to take care of them. They've lost their husband, and now they don't have someone to protect them in that world. Verse 4, though, continues, "The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan, her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter." What this line is saying is this: Jerusalem once was a city of celebration. Its roads that led to the city was filled with pilgrims, people going there to celebrate Passover, going there to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, going there to make sacrifices and worshiping Yahweh. And now the streets, the cities leading to Jerusalem, are desolate. No one is on them. The only people that are on them are people who are dying, and the only people on them who actually can say anything are those who are mourning. The text in verse 4 mentions how there are priests and that there are young maidens mourning. It is important to know that priests and that these young maidens would have been people actually leading in celebrations, leading in worship songs of praise. They were also known to lead in songs of lament. And so therefore them showing up here makes sense. So she's not just a widow, the city of Jerusalem, but she is a widow who is in mourning. We find out later on in verse 5 that this woman's children have been taken from her, put into captivity, talking about Babylon taking the Israelites and putting them into captivity. So now she's not just a widow who's in mourning. She is now a widow in mourning and who has also lost her kids. She does not have her husband there, and now she also does not have her children. But likely the most heart-wrenching moment we have in chapter 1 is found in verses 8 through 10. It says this: Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a mockery. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Her downfall was appalling, with none to comfort her. She says, "O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Enemies have stretched out their hands over all her precious things. She has seen even the nations invade her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation." In these small little verses, we recall the moment of the siege of Jerusalem, how Babylon comes through and invades the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had sinned because its kings, its prophets, and its priests were worshiping other gods. In the ancient world, especially when it came to the Israelites, idolatry often equated to sexual immorality. The idea is this: Israel entered into a covenantal relationship with God, saying that only would they worship God and no other God would they worship. And yet, and going against that promise, it is like a wife or a husband having an affair, a marital affair, breaking that covenantal vow, and then going off with someone else. And so as it talks about this woman having uncleanness in her skirts, it is referring back to this idol worship that actually took place in the temple in Jerusalem. We actually have different books in the Bible talk about how they ascribed and they built different models of gods in the temple to worship. In God's temple, they worshiped other gods. They put engravings on the wall that were not supposed to be there, and they worshiped those gods. And so as it talks about this city, Jerusalem, as a widow who has been left behind, it is because of the sexual promiscuity, which is ultimately about her idolatry, but it gets even worse. Did you notice the text? It starts off as voluntary sexual immorality. Israel choosing to do this. But then she's thrown on the ground, is what the text says. She's in pain. She's being violently attacked, and she's even being invaded. This is not PG-13 type of things. This is not something anyone should ever see or experience. What this lamentation is talking about is that the widow city of Jerusalem has been attacked and has been raped by those she actually had the affair with. Jerusalem buddied up to these other nations and trusted in them more than trusting in God. They voluntarily chose to do this. And yet, in doing that, these nations that they relied upon, these other gods, these false gods that they relied upon, end up betraying her and ends up using her for their own gain. We are left, therefore, looking at a city, at a widow who is left destitute. When it comes to poetry, we are supposed to let the metaphors tell us what we're supposed to be taking and what we're supposed to be feeling. As we look at this idea of hearing the widow, we see, well, this is what sin leads to. It leads to destruction. It leads to desolation. But we are also left with having compassion for this city. No one could read Lamentations 1, even knowing the history, the sin that led up to it, and think to themselves, I'm so glad this is happening to Jerusalem. No one could look and say, you know what? You deserve every bit of this, and I'm glad it's happening to you. Everyone, as they read Lamentations, even though they know the sins of the Israelites, want God to show up. They want God to say, enough is enough. Justice has been poured out, and I'm now going to show up and be with you. And so in this moment, going back to session 1, we are developing a heart for the broken, but also for those who break others. And so as we hear the woman's situation in Lamentations 1, we discover that she is a widow, that her husband has left her, which is God. We discover that she has no more children around her, for they've been taken away or killed. And we've discovered that she's been left behind by the people that she actually put her hope in. And so as sorrow is shouted, we hear it, but also we are asked to look at it. The widow's city, multiple times in chapter 1, uses this refrain to look upon her. I find it fascinating, this again, just going into the poetry. This woman is on the ground in pain. She knows of her shame, and yet she tells people to look at her, to look at her, to look at her. For example, she talks to those who are passing by her. Chapter 1, verse 12, it says this, "Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger." Verse 18 says, acknowledging the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and behold my suffering. My young women and young men have gone into captivity. But Jerusalem doesn't just tell the passerbys to look at her. Jerusalem also addresses God and says, God, I want you to look at me as well. Verse 9, O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Verse 11, all her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see how worthless I have become. And verse 20, it continues addressing the Lord. See, O Lord, how distressed I am. My stomach churns, talking about starvation. My heart is wrung within me because I have been very rebellious. In the street, the sword bereaves. In the house, it is like death. So we see this over and over again of this desire for people to look upon this sorrow, to look upon this affliction in a society that would rather mask death, to put death over there in a box and then not mess with it, in a society that wants to have the Joker effect, to have a smile on our face always and not talk about what's bad going on, in a society that actually has learned to numb itself to pain. Lamentation says, wake up and see the pain in the world. Do not shy away from lament, to not shy away from the sorrow. In fact, the poetry of Lamentations doesn't just give us a general idea, but it invites us to zoom into the pain. It does this 3 different times. And it happens in chapter 1, and then it happens in chapter 3, this idea of a general image being talked about, and then a zooming in to the image to intensify the pain. I think this is really important for us, church. As people who want to easily just step over the pain, it's saying not only do I want you to see the pain, I want you to see how bad this pain is. I want you to feel this pain. So you see this in verse 2. The text says, she weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. So you see the general, she's weeping, but then there are tears coming down her cheeks. So the general is, she's weeping, and then it zooms in. It says, look at the tears coming down her cheeks. Verse 16, it does similarly. She says, for these things I weep, that's the general, so weeping, my eyes flow with tears. So now it's not just weeping and that there are, stains on her cheeks from the crying. Now it's just this gush, this river flowing out of her eyes, this intensity of the moment. This happens also in Lamentations 3:48 and on. Let's go ahead and read this, 48 through about 51. The text says, my eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of my people. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes cause me grief at the fate of all my young women in my city. And so, as Lamentations shouts this sorrow, we are not just invited to hear it, but we are called to look upon the pain, the injustice, and the feeling of being afflicted and left and abandoned by God in the text. This last one of chapter 3 saying, I weep until God hears me, might make some of us feel uncomfortable. Is it okay to say, I demand for God to give me attention? Is it okay for us to say, I'm going to cry out tears until the Lord of heaven hears me? And this leads me into the third one. As sorrow shouts, we hear it, we look at it, but then we also are left with a question. And that question is, will God show up? Several times, 6 times to be exact in Lamentations, the poem will use this word comfort. It's always used in the negative. No one is there to comfort Jerusalem. No one is there to comfort Zion. No one is there to console her. Even in chapter 2, there's this sense of maybe I can offer some words that help her, and yet it ends with saying there is nothing that I can say to offer her comfort. What do we do in these moments where nothing can actually offer us comfort? No words of hope matter. They just seem cheap to us. What Lamentations asks us to do, invites us to do, what ultimately I think God invites us to do is to go to him and to demand his attention. Now, we live in a world that seems taboo. Who am I to be talking to God? And yet what the Bible, especially the Old Testament, demonstrates to us is that God desires not just those moments in our lives that are good to go to him, but also those moments in our lives where things are not so good to also go to him. I tell my son this all the time. Asa is his name. I say, Asa, I don't want you just to come to me when things are good. I want you to come to me when you're actually angry with me, when you are questioning me. Because in that moment, that demonstrates to me his trust is in me. And even if he's angry with me, he's going to the only person that he thinks can actually solve the problem. He's going to the only one that ultimately matters. And so Lamentations recognizes there's no one else to go to. We can't go to those false idols anymore. The nations have abandoned us. We can't go to them. God seems to have abandoned us, but I'm going to continue to demand his guidance. I'm going to continue to demand his attention. And so the words are lifted up to God. Will you look at me? Will you pay me attention? We see that there are certain characters throughout the Old Testament who do this, and the result is God responds not out of anger, not out of how dare you speak to me, aunt, but instead actually engages in the dialogue. For example, In Genesis 18, Abraham is having a conversation with God, and he finds out that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham in that moment could have just said, "You do your thing, God. I'm not going to say anything," but instead actually questions God. "Lord, is it righteous of you to do that? Is it just of you to do that if there's some righteous people in the cities?" Notice God's response in Genesis 18 is not, "How dare you talk to me?" But in fact, he enters into dialogue and says, "You're correct." And then he's able to say, I'll actually spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there's 100 righteous people. Moses also does this when he learns from God that God says, "I'm going to start over with you, Moses. This Israelite people are rebellious. They're too much like the Egyptians. So I'm going to be done with them. And I'm going to start over with you." And in that moment, what does Moses do? He goes to God and he questions God and says, "Lord, is this just? Is this merciful?" In that moment, God does not destroy him, doesn't smite him, but instead enters into conversation with him and says, "You're right, I will not destroy them." We see this in the book of Job, how Job in his frustration cries out to God, demanding an answer. And I know we like to go to the book of Job and say, look how God responds to Job and says, "Who are you to question me?" But that's actually not what the message is. The point is that God shows up to Job and has a conversation with him. Matter of fact, he goes to Job's friends and says, "You spoke of me poorly." But he does not say anything like that to Job himself. He enters into dialogue with Job. And so in the same sense, Lamentations invites us to enter into dialogue with God as we hear sorrow, as we look at sorrow, and as we question, where is God in the midst of the sorrow? In moments of sorrow, it is tempting to give answers of hope. C.S. Lewis heard a lot of answers of hope after his wife had died from people around him. Things like, "It's all going to be okay. God has a plan." And ultimately, C.S. Lewis just said, "These things are just not enough. It seems like I'm met with silence from God, and I don't know what to do with these moments." It is important to note, though, that C.S. Lewis stays faithful to God, continues to have a relationship with God, and he continues to go to God as he's discipled by Jesus. And so, I want to leave us with this. When we experience sorrow, or we are serving and being with people who are experiencing sorrow, we might feel tempted to give theological answers to the problem of suffering. And they are totally theological answers. I think C.S. Lewis knew these theological answers, but he recognized that sometimes hope comes across cheap when someone hasn't experienced sorrow. We can give answers, and we should be able to give answers to why bad things happen, seemingly to those who are innocent. There are times where we will have to give those answers. But Lamentations chapter 1 is inviting us to say, we need to lament and feel the suffering before we offer words of hope. Experience the suffering before we offer answers of glory and hope of our God. And I think what we will find out is that when we first feel the suffering and the sorrow of those in the midst of it, the answers of hope end up sounding much more beautiful than they would have before when we just offered them without experiencing it at all. And so Lamentations is ultimately challenging us to say this: hope will have its day once lament has had its day.